June 1998. A Dodge finished first and second in class at Le Mans, beating Porsche and Ferrari, with no ABS, no traction control, and a budget the European factory teams would have laughed at. So, how does a car that beats the world's best on the longest circuit in motorsport end up remembered as the Widowmaker that never became an icon? The answer starts not with the car itself, but with the company that built it, a company that had almost nothing left to lose. By the late 1980s, Chrysler was not in a good place. The company had spent most of the decade clawing its way back from near bankruptcy, surviving on government loans and a lineup of practical, forgettable vehicles. The K car saved the company. It didn't exactly fire the imagination. And there were people inside Chrysler who felt that tension deeply, who believed that a car company without something to believe in was just an appliance manufacturer with a logo. Bob Lutz was one of them. Lutz was Chrysler's president at the time, and his philosophy was straightforward. Build something that makes people feel something, not something that scored well in clinics, not something the accountants blessed first, not something designed by committee to offend no one. Something real, something that made the people who saw it stop walking and just look. Carroll Shelby was the other voice pushing in the same direction. Shelby had spent his career proving that American machines could compete with anything Europe built, and he wasn't finished making that argument. The two of them, along with a small group of engineers who shared the same conviction, began sketching out what would become the Viper. The brief was almost insultingly simple: a front engine, rear-wheel drive, two-seat American sports car. A big V10, no roof, no compromises, no apologies. The original RT10 Roadster arrived in 1992, and it was exactly what that brief described. It had no exterior door handles, no side windows, no roll-up glass at all, just removable side curtains that you stuff behind the seat. The exhaust pipes ran along the sills and got hot enough to burn skin through denim. The engine generated so much heat that the cockpit became genuinely uncomfortable in summer traffic. Automotive journalists drove it and came back with two reactions. Either it was the most alive thing they had ever sat in, or it was completely and dangerously unhinged. Sometimes both, in the same review. The public reacted with something closer to pure excitement. People lined up at auto shows just to stand near it. Dealers reported waiting lists before a single production car had been delivered. Here was an American car that looked like it had arrived from somewhere more dramatic, built with an attitude that felt entirely foreign to the cautious, market research-driven thinking that had dominated Detroit for a generation. But there was a conversation happening inside Chrysler at the same time. The RT10 was a statement. It was raw, it was spectacular, and it was difficult to live with. If the Viper was going to be more than a limited-run curiosity, if it was going to compete with Porsche and Ferrari in any sustained way, it needed something the Roadster couldn't offer. It needed a roof. The GTS coupe proposal built on that argument. The idea was to take everything that made the RT10 extraordinary and give it a real cockpit, proper windows, a double-bubble roofline that gave helmet clearance without raising the overall height, a purpose-designed interior that wrapped the driver in leather and aluminum without adding clutter. The same V10, the same raw mechanical character, but delivered in a body that acknowledged a driver might want to use the car on a Tuesday, not just a track day. The double-bubble roofline wasn't invented for the GTS. It was borrowed deliberately from the 1965 Shelby Daytona coupe. That was a conscious decision. The design team understood the language they were speaking, and they wanted the GTS to exist inside a specific tradition of American endurance racing history. This wasn't styling for its own sake. It was a declaration about what the car intended to be. Getting there, though, required an engine that barely made sense on paper, one that had started life in a completely different world, been handed to engineers who spoke a different design language entirely, and emerged as something Detroit had never produced before. That isn't the sound of a supercar. That's the sound of 8 liters of American heavy-duty industrialism being forced to go fast. The 8-liter V10 that powered the Viper GTS did not begin its life as a sports car engine. It started as a concept for a heavy-duty truck, a power plant designed to move weight, not chase lap times. Chrysler had acquired Lamborghini in 1987, and that acquisition quietly changed everything about what the Viper's engine would become. The brief went to Lamborghini's engineering team in Sant'Agata, and what came back was something that no longer resembled a truck engine in anything but its basic architecture. The displacement stayed enormous. That was the point. The philosophy behind this engine was a direct challenge to the direction European performance engineering was heading at the time. Turbocharged engines were getting smaller, more complex, more dependent on electronics to manage their power delivery. The Viper's engine went the opposite direction entirely. No turbocharger, no supercharger, no variable valve timing, no drive-by-wire throttle management. Just 8 liters of displacement, 10 cylinders, and a mechanical directness that had almost disappeared from production cars by the mid-1990s. 450 horsepower, 520 pound-feet of torque. When the GTS arrived in 1996, those numbers were genuinely embarrassing for the competition. Ferrari and Porsche were charging twice the price for comparable or lesser output. The GTS delivered that, not through sophisticated engine management or forced induction, but through sheer cubic inches and a stubborn refusal to rely on anything that couldn't be understood by looking at it. Every throttle input came back through the firewall as sensation. The power didn't arrive in a smooth wave managed by software. It built and pushed with a physical presence that reminded the driver continuously that something serious was happening under that long hood. The sound was unlike anything in production at the time. A deep rolling exhaust note with nothing in common with a Ferrari V8 or a Porsche Flat 6. Unmistakable and slightly threatening. The side exhausts were part of that character, and they were also a genuine hazard. They ran along the sills, tucked close to the body, and they got hot. Not warm, not uncomfortable, genuinely hot enough to cause serious burns through clothing if a driver or passenger made contact during or after a run. Dodge knew this. The engineering team knew this. The car shipped anyway because the alternative was routing the exhaust in a way that compromised the weight distribution and the sound character the team had worked to achieve. The cabin heat was another reality nobody apologized for. In summer traffic, the cockpit temperature climbed in a way that reminded occupants they were sitting next to a large, angry, naturally aspirated engine with no meaningful thermal barrier between them and it. Air conditioning was available, and it worked, but it was working against physics in a way that felt honest. This was not a grand touring car pretending to be a sports car. The environment told the truth about what the car was. There was also no electronic throttle management between the driver's right foot and the engine. The connection was mechanical, direct, and immediate. Press the pedal, and the engine responded without delay, without software interpreting the input, without any system deciding how much of what the driver asked for should actually be delivered. That directness was a design choice with consequences the team fully understood. It meant the engine was extraordinary. It also meant the chassis that carried it had to be built to match. And it meant that the driver sitting between the two of them had better know exactly what they were doing. In Detroit, the engine was only half the argument. The body that carried it was equally deliberate, equally uncompromising, and equally unlike anything else Dodge had produced in living memory. The GTS was built around a tubular steel frame, and its exterior panels were hand-laid fiberglass and composite construction, not stamped steel, not the mass production process that every other car in the Dodge lineup went through. Each panel was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and expensive in a way that made the accounting department deeply uncomfortable. Dodge did it anyway. That double-bubble roofline was more than a nod to history. The geometry had a functional purpose. Raising the roof height to give helmet clearance would have changed the car's proportions, raised its center of gravity slightly, and made it look taller and softer than the design team intended. The double-bubble solution kept the roofline low and tight while creating just enough space for a helmeted head on each side. It was a problem solved with intelligence rather than compromise, which described the whole car. The proportions that resulted were remarkable: long hood, short rear deck, wide haunches, and a roofline that sat low enough to feel aggressive even standing still. The GTS looked fast from every angle, not because the designers were trying to suggest speed through styling tricks, but because the dimensions were determined by what the car needed to do. Form followed function, and the function was impressive enough that the form became genuinely beautiful. The interior reflected the same thinking. Sparse, but not in a cost-cutting way. Sparse the way a workshop is spare, where everything present has a reason to be there. Leather covered most surfaces. Aluminum trim appeared where it needed to. The instrument cluster put the tachometer and speedometer directly in the driver's line of sight. No information screens, no multifunction displays, nothing asking the driver to look away. No cup holders, no dead pedal, no side airbags until much later. And if a driver wore shorts, the side exit exhausts were waiting to leave a permanent souvenir on their calf. The shifter sat close, with throws that were short and deliberate. The driving position placed the driver low and tight to the transmission tunnel. Everything communicated the same message as the exterior. This was a machine built around the act of driving, not the experience of being transported. The suspension geometry reinforced that message completely. The engineers tuned the GTS for feel over compliance. On a smooth road or a clean circuit, the feedback through the steering wheel and the seat was precise and immediate. The car told the driver what the tires were doing, what the surface was offering, and where the limits were approaching. On a rough road, that same sensitivity meant every imperfection came through. There was no softness built in to protect the driver from information. That was a philosophical choice more than an engineering limitation. The team believed the driver should be fully informed at all times. A sports car that hid its behavior to make the experience more comfortable was, in their view, not really a sports car. It was something else dressed up to look like one. So, the suspension stayed honest. And then came the decision that would define the GTS more than any other single choice. The decision that would win at Le Mans and kill people on public roads. The decision to build a car with no ABS, no traction control, and no electronic system standing between the driver's inputs and the consequences of getting them wrong. That wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. The engineers had made their argument on paper. Now they needed to make it on track. In 1998, Dodge entered the GTSR at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The GTSR was a racing variant built directly from the street car, carrying the same fundamental architecture, the same displacement philosophy, the same refusal to rely on complexity when cubic inches and mechanical integrity could do the work instead. It ran in the GT2 class, competing against machines that represented the very best of European endurance racing at that moment. The competition was serious. Porsche had entered the 911 GT2, a car with decades of Le Mans heritage behind it, factory support, and a development program funded at a level that reflected how seriously Porsche took the class. Ferrari had brought the 550 Maranello, a newer machine carrying the full weight of Ferrari's endurance racing reputation. Both teams arrived at Circuit de la Sarthe with the kind of institutional confidence that comes from winning there before. The Vipers were run by the Oreca team, a French motorsport operation that took on the project with resources that were modest by comparison. The budget available to Oreca was a fraction of what the factory Porsche effort was working with. The team prepared the cars carefully, understood the strategy the race required, and went to work. What happened over the next 24 hours was a quiet lesson in what the GTSR's engineering philosophy actually meant under sustained racing conditions. The fastest cars in the class set quicker individual lap times early in the race. That was expected. The GTSR was not built to be the fastest car over a single flying lap. It was built to be the most reliable car over a full day, to put torque to the ground consistently, to absorb the punishment of a long race without asking for mercy. The V10's enormous torque output meant the drivers could use shorter rev ranges, reducing mechanical stress across the long, straight sections and the slower corners where lesser torque required more aggressive gearing. The strategy was patient, and it was correct. Around the 14th hour, one of the Viper crews reported a vibration through the steering column on the Mulsanne, not violent, but persistent. The team assessed it from the pit wall, made the call to keep running, and adjusted the driver's pace by a fraction. The vibration didn't worsen. The car held. As the hours accumulated, the race sorted itself the way long races always do. Faster cars retired, mechanical failures accumulated, errors under fatigue multiplied. The Vipers kept running, clean and consistent, hour after hour. When the final standings were confirmed, the GTSR had finished first and second in the GT2 class. The motorsport world paused. The American press treated it as the vindication it was. A car built on a comparatively small budget, developed from a production road car, had beaten established European factory efforts at the most demanding endurance race on the calendar. The result was not luck. You don't finish first and second by luck at Le Mans. You finish first and second by being prepared, by having a car that doesn't break, and by executing a strategy over 24 hours without mistakes. The European press found the result harder to process. Some emphasized the reliability angle, as though winning through durability was a lesser form of victory. That framing missed the point entirely. Le Mans rewards the car that finishes, and the car that finishes reliably is the car that was engineered correctly. The win validated everything the GTSR's designers had believed from the beginning. Simplicity wasn't a limitation. Displacement wasn't an outdated approach. A car that communicated honestly with its driver, that put mechanical integrity ahead of electronic complexity, could compete at the highest level of international motorsport and win. The argument Lutz and Shelby had been making since the late 1980s had been proved in the most visible way available. Back in Sant'Agata and Stuttgart, engineering teams quietly took note. But Le Mans and the public road are two different places entirely. The same character that kept those GTSR cars running for 24 hours on a closed circuit was doing something very different to drivers on ordinary roads. And that story was not going to end with a podium. The Le Mans win landed in June 1998, and the headlines celebrated it the way a result like that deserved. But while the motorsport press was writing about vindication and American engineering pride, the insurance adjusters in America were looking at a completely different set of numbers. And those numbers were not a celebration. Something quieter and far more troubling was accumulating in insurance records, police reports, and hospital files across the country. By the late 1990s, Viper crash statistics were telling a story that nobody at Dodge wanted to read out loud. Drivers were losing control, regularly, sometimes fatally. The car that had just finished first and second at the most demanding endurance race in the world was killing people on public roads, and the reason wasn't mechanical failure. The reason was the same philosophy that made it extraordinary. A machine built to reward complete driver competence had found its way into the hands of people who didn't have it. Here's what happened when things went wrong. Lift the throttle mid-corner at speed, and the weight transfer was immediate and severe. The rear of the car moved faster than most drivers expected, and it moved without the graduated warning that a well-sorted sports car provides. There was no gradual slide, no gentle push telling the driver the limit was approaching. There was grip, and then there was not grip. And the transition between those two states happened in a time frame that left very little room for recovery. No ABS meant panic braking was a different kind of problem entirely. Lock the wheels under hard braking, and the car went straight. Not toward the corner the driver was trying to reach, not in the direction the steering wheel was pointed, simply straight. Physics took over completely, and the 450 horsepower, 4,000-pound machine went wherever momentum decided to send it. On a track, with an experienced driver who had trained for that moment, the response was manageable. On a public road, with a driver who had never been in that situation before, the outcome was often catastrophic. Wet roads made the traction problem a different conversation entirely. Any meaningful throttle excess on a damp surface and the rear wheels broke traction with a speed and decisiveness that the car's size and power turned into a genuine emergency. A small car with modest torque can be caught and corrected when the rear steps out. The Viper's 520 pound-feet of torque delivered to the rear wheels with no electronic mediation of any kind created slides that required a level of car control that most road drivers simply don't possess and have never needed to develop. Dodge's own internal data told a difficult story about who was buying the car. The Viper attracted buyers who were drawn by the reputation, the looks, and the Le Mans credibility. Many of them had come from more forgiving machines, from performance cars that had electronic safety systems quietly working to keep them out of trouble. They had never experienced a car that provided no such assistance, that simply did exactly what the driver asked and held them fully responsible for the outcome. The Widowmaker label appeared in enthusiast circles first, then it moved into the mainstream automotive press. Then it reached the general public, and the general public passed it to their insurance companies. By the late 1990s, Viper insurance premiums had climbed to levels that pushed the car out of reach for younger buyers, exactly the demographic that a sports car needs to build the kind of cultural momentum that turns a vehicle into an icon. The mass market breakthrough Dodge had planned did not happen. Dealers reported a consistent pattern. Customers came in excited, drawn by everything the GTS represented, sat in it, heard the reputation explained in honest terms, and walked out. Not every customer, but enough of them, often enough, that the sales trajectory that would have justified the hand-built production costs never materialized. The internal debate about adding electronic driver aids became bitter. One side of that argument held that the car's soul lived in its rawness, that adding traction control, or ABS, would change what the GTS fundamentally was, would make it something softer and safer, and less true to the original conviction. The other side pointed at the crash reports and argued that people were dying, and that a car with a Widowmaker reputation couldn't build a following large enough to survive. Both sides were right. That was the problem, and the answer Dodge eventually arrived at didn't fully satisfy either of them. The first-generation GTS had arrived in 1996 with its character fully intact and its philosophy completely uncompromised. The updates that followed over the next few years were careful, incremental, and aimed at the edges rather than the core. Better ventilation, improved sealing around the doors and roof, small refinements to the interior that made long journeys less demanding without changing what the car was at its foundation. The Widowmaker reputation didn't soften with those changes, because the Widowmaker reputation was built on the drivetrain and the chassis, and neither of those things changed. The harder decisions came in the early years of the new decade. Side curtain airbags arrived, a concession to safety standards that the purist community accepted without much resistance because passive restraints didn't alter the driving experience. Then traction control appeared on later production models, and that was a different conversation. The community that had formed around the Viper's raw character treated each electronic addition as a kind of erosion, a small surrender to the same cautious, committee-driven thinking that the car had been built specifically to reject. The sales numbers through this period told a complicated story. They didn't collapse. The Viper never became a failure in the way that word is usually applied to cars, but they didn't grow either, not in the sustained way that would have justified the production model Dodge was running. Hand-built cars assembled in small volumes with composite body panels and labor-intensive construction are expensive to make, and making them economically requires either a very high price or a meaningful volume. The Viper was hitting neither number comfortably. The cultural moment that should have belonged to the GTS went largely to the Corvette Zia 06. That was the harder reality. The Z06 arrived in 2001 with performance figures that sat in the same conversation as the Viper, and it offered those figures with a chassis that included the electronic safety net the GTS refused to provide. Buyers who wanted serious American performance without the genuine risk profile of the Viper had a credible alternative. Many of them took it. The GTS ended up in a position that no product planning document had anticipated. Too dangerous for the buyers who wanted to enjoy the experience casually. Too softened once the aids arrived, for the buyers who had built an identity around the car's uncompromising rawness. The middle ground it occupied was real, but it was narrower than Dodge had needed it to be. What remained after the sales figures were filed and the cultural moment passed was something more durable than either a success or a failure. The Viper GTS was not a failure. That word doesn't fit what it actually was. It was a philosophical statement, a declaration that American engineers, given permission to ignore the spreadsheet and build something they believed in, could produce a world-class machine on a budget that European manufacturers would have considered inadequate for a serious development program. That argument was made in metal and composite and 8 liters of displacement, and it was proved on the longest, most demanding stage the motorsport world offered. The Le Mans win in 1998 remains one of the most significant American motorsport achievements of that decade. Not because it was surprising, though it was, but because of what it said about the approach behind it. Simplicity, torque, and mechanical integrity. Those were the tools, and they were enough. The cars that survived are worth substantially more today than they were when new. The market eventually recognized something the sales figures never fully captured. A clean GTS from the late 1990s, in good condition, commands prices that reflect a growing understanding of what those cars actually represented. Collectors who passed on them at the time are not making that mistake again. There's a version of the Viper's story that frames it as a cautionary tale about what happens when engineers are allowed to ignore practical reality. That version misses what the car actually proved. The practical reality was that Dodge built a genuine supercar without a supercar budget, ran it at Le Mans, and brought it home first. That isn't a cautionary tale. That's a remarkable achievement dressed in a difficult package. The GTS represents something specific and worth naming clearly. It was the last moment Detroit built something purely because it believed in the idea, not because the research approved it, not because the safety engineers signed off on the concept before the first sketch was drawn, not because a demographic study identified an underserved market segment, because a small group of people with conviction and authority decided that the car should exist and then built it the way they thought it should be built. That kind of decision produced something real. It also produced consequences. Both things are true, and neither one cancels the other out. Some machines earn their place in history the hard way, and the Viper GTS earned every part of its reputation. The GTS asked more of its driver than any other production car of its era, and most drivers weren't ready for that conversation. That gap between what the car was and what the market needed is exactly what makes it worth remembering. If this era of uncompromising American design means something to you, leave a favorite detail in the comments below. And if you want to see what happens when a company does everything right and still misses, watch the Toyota Avalon story next. In 1995, Toyota launched a car they believed would define American luxury for a generation: a flat floor, more interior space than a Crown Victoria, a name that literally meant paradise. Everything pointed to success. Something went wrong anyway.